Today, I am going to talk about Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 of the book Finding Genuine Practice by the Gyalwang Karmapa. Chapter 4 is titled Cherish the Difficult. The book is about the 8 verses of training the mind. And so this is about the fourth verse, and this is what it says. Whenever I see ill-natured beings or those overwhelmed by heavy misdeeds or suffering, I will cherish them as something rare, as though I had found a priceless treasure. So this is a central core of Mahayana Buddhism, which is wanting to have compassion and loving kindness towards all beings. And these difficult beings actually are really important for us to be able to develop our compassion and our loving kindness. Ordinarily, we like to think that, well, if someone is nice to me, I will be nice to them. And since most people are nice to me, I'm nice to most of them. And maybe I'm even nice to some people that are a little bit rude and so forth. Here's a quote from the Dalai Lama that I like. Even a dog will be nice to the person who feeds it. And this is calling for us to be better than a dog. It is these troublesome, ill-natured, harmful beings that in particular we need to feel loving kindness and compassion for, because it is difficult. The common reaction, of course, is to people like this, is that they need to be taken down a notch or two. Or if something bad happens to them, well, they deserved it. They got their comeuppance. Or in some traditions, they're being punished by God or by a higher power or by their karma. This is their karma, etc. And then we don't really feel compassion for them. So here, this is actually more important than having love and compassion for our friends and our close family, because it's more difficult. And this is how we, you might say, develop our compassion muscle, by having it bear weight, by doing difficult things. The Karmapa said, this is where we really can tell how we are doing with loving kindness and compassion. He said that we have to avoid pretending that we have them when we don't, or denying that we don't have them. That when a person has harmed you and is in pain or having difficulty, it's really important to examine how you feel towards that person. Do you want to help them? Do you want them to suffer less? Do you want more suffering on their part? Whatever you see, he says, don't beat yourself up. That this isn't what it's all about. This is just gauging where we are. And then we have a place to start from, to work on. of course, aspire to do better. But this is how we measure how we are doing in our practice of loving kindness and compassion for all beings. It is how we react to difficult people when they harm us, or in many cases, harm other beings, such as a businessman that employs people under unsafe conditions or pays very low wages, and or a person that abuses a dog, and so forth. Then all of these things, how we react to people like that, or when people are harming us in some way or another, or even getting in the way when we're in a hurry on the highway, that this is how we gauge how we are doing. He says, when a difficult person is having trouble, said, don't just recite Om Mani Padme Hung and say, poor thing, and then look away and go on with it. That this is not a proper way to use this situation or relate to a person that is, or an animal that's having difficulty. He says, actually, this kind of reaction is one of the 8 worldly concerns. It has to do, and the 8 worldly concerns have to do with praise and blame, gain and loss, fame and insignificance, pleasure and pain. So he says, by just reciting Om Mani Padme Hung and thinking, oh, poor thing, and then going on with your life, this is pretending to be something that you're really not. This doesn't mean don't say Om Mani Padme Hung, but don't be just superficial about it. Or when you look and you find that you have no compassion for a person that has harmed you and now they are suffering. Again, he says, don't just say Om Mani Padme Hung and say poor thing and then get on with your life. He's talking about feeling these things at a much deeper level, at a heart level, rather than a very superficial level. And so this is very important. So if you find that you have no loving kindness and compassion for a difficult person, fine, because now you've learned something. You know this is where you are, and this is what you have to work with. It's important to be realistic. I like to use the example of a GPS. If you want to go to a certain place, let's say Minneapolis, the GPS will help you as long as you enter your present location. And so while we are trying to travel the path and we know what the goal is, but if we don't know our present location, we don't know how to get to the goal. So the clearer a picture we have of ourselves, our faults, our good points, how strong our loving kindness and compassion is, and so forth. If we don't know that, then we really don't have much to work with. We could just be, as to use the word that he used, is pretending. So this is extremely important, to have a clear view of where we are right now. and what we need to work on and work with. He also says when other people are having difficulties, when troublemakers are having difficulties, it's especially important, and those were his words, especially important, that if we can influence that person to improve and transform and become a better natured person, to let go of some of their coarser habits and so forth. In that chapter, he has a quote that jumped out at me as, quote, as someone who is practicing bodhicitta, loving kindness and compassion, we should try to respect that person and treat them well. I think that's really a very important point today on election day in the United States about the people that are on the other side of the people that you voted for. You might say the people that are in opposition to the people that you voted for. That even though they may be ill-natured and so forth, that we need to treat them with respect and treat them as above you. And respect is kind of a feeling of having admiration or high regard. Maybe that's a better word, high regard for someone. And again, what's talked about here is holding them above yourself, as opposed to holding them below yourself, and perhaps even using condemning language. Again, this isn't agreeing with their behavior or their feelings and who they voted for and so forth, but if we're going to be bodhisattvas in training, if we are working on our bodhicitta, then this is what is necessary. So Karmapa says that when we are harmed by someone and anger arises, that's a problem. It's doubly a problem when not only does anger arise, but we feel they are not worthy of our compassion, worthy of our respect, worthy of our time, worthy of our concern, that they don't matter. And a mistake that I see some Buddhists make, non-Buddhists make this mistake too, is that to have pity for a puppy and then have anger for the abuser of the puppy. Or to, when I talk about going in and meeting with the inmates and talking about Buddhism, sometimes people talk about how horrible the criminal justice system is and incarceration is and so on and so forth. And again, they have pity for the inmate. And pity is a near enemy of compassion, because pity is holding yourself up here and the being that you're having pity for is down there. It's a feeling of superiority when you have pity. On the other hand, when you are working with inmates, some of them probably are puppy abusers. And certainly many inmates are in the criminal justice system because of sexual assault allegations. And then maybe that's a little bit scary if you look at it that way. So actually, pity is an enemy of compassion. And I guess where I'm going with this too is we have to keep our eyes open to the whole situation and not see it through the way we would like to see it or we usually see it, but better to see it the way it is. And I think that's a good place to end this chapter 4. Now I'm going to move on to chapter 5, which is train to accept defeat. The verses are, or the 4 lines of this verse are, whenever someone out of envy does me wrong by attacking or belittling me, I will take defeat on myself and give the victory to others. To open up his discussion of this verse, he talks about 3 methods of arousing bodhicitta. And what this bodhicitta is the motivation to bring all sentient beings to Buddhahood. So 3 methods of developing this motivation and aspiration to bring all beings to Buddhahood, not just some. The first one he mentioned was meditating on the 7 causes and results. And to preface this a little bit, these verses of mind training, 8 verses of mind training, come from the Kadampa tradition. And one of the things that the Kadampas really used a lot were lists. As you know, there is the 7 points of mind training, which we studied through a previous book, and there were 59 slogans. And so they will have these lists of, you could say slogans or just lists. When they teach impermanence, there will be a list of things to contemplate and look at. So here is the 7 causes and results. There's a footnote in the book, which I went back to. It was really easy. You just click on the link. And these are contemplations for generating bodhicitta. Some of them you will be familiar with if you've studied the 7 points of mind training. So the first one is to recognize all sentient beings as our mothers. The second one is to recognize our mother's kindness, to contemplate our mother's kindness. What she has done for us right from the very beginning of becoming pregnant to giving birth to making sure that we were fed and clothed and taken care of and so forth. Then contemplate how to return her kindness. Then there is deepening this and widening it by contemplating affectionate love for all sentient beings. You could say great love. And that is wanting all sentient beings to be happy. The 5th one is great compassion, and this is wanting all sentient beings to be free of suffering. And then the 6th one is extraordinary intention. that you want to be able to be the one that leads all of them to Buddhahood, to liberation and total freedom from suffering. And then finally, bodhicitta. And here it's talking about not only love and compassion and developing this motivation to lead all beings to a complete liberation, but also ultimate bodhicitta, and that is understanding the illusory nature of appearances. Now, after going through all that, he said, but that's not what we're going to be talking about in this chapter. But I think it's important to be aware of this, because this is not insignificant. And that's why I brought this up and went to the footnotes. The second is, and this is methods of arousing bodhicitta, of strengthening our motivation to lead all beings to liberation. And the second one is to meditate on the equality of self and others. And again, that's not what he's going to be talking about here in this chapter. Our previous chapter, he taught about holding others. In a previous chapter, he taught about us holding others above us, which is different than the equality of self and others. This is that others are above you. So the third one is the method he's going to be talking about in this chapter, and that is exchanging self and other. As I said, all of these came from the Karmapa tradition, and they were brought to the Kagyu lineage by Gampopa, and all the other three lineages of Tibetan Buddhism have incorporated the Karmapa teachings, and it no longer exists as a separate lineage. What we want to aim for, His Holiness says, is, quote, such intense cherishing of and love for, end quote, others that we won't be concerned for how difficult it is for ourselves. He said, eventually, as we train, we don't even think about our happiness or our possessions, that we just want to help others. And two words are really important here that he brings up. One is courage, and the other is conviction. So we need to have conviction in our aspirations, conviction in the path, conviction in these practices. And then we have to have courage to carry them out. This is not for the faint of heart, because this really goes against conventional wisdom, and it certainly goes against our ego. Our ego does not want us to let go of things. The first two lines of this verse are about envy. It's mentioned in the second line that people that are attacking us or harming us from envy can do us a lot of harm and can do others a lot of harm. It's important to remember that these beings are controlled by the klesha of envy. And it's important to remember that we are practicing loving kindness and compassion. And this is regardless of what another person is doing to us or their attitude and so forth. if we look closely, we'll see that the problem lies in the affliction, which controls the person. That retaliating against the person misses the mark because the person isn't to blame, it's the klesha. Also, if we retaliate and try to, in some way or another, attack the person that goes against our mind training, then we don't want to do that either. Karmapa uses the example of getting beaten with a stick. And those of you that have been taking part in this book class over the last few years will remember there's another book of his that he brought this up to. Very same example. That when we are getting beaten by a stick, the problem isn't the stick. The problem is the person who's holding on to the stick, that's controlling the stick. And if we look at the person that is causing us harm, you will see that they are being controlled by the klesha of, in this case, envy. So that means that that's where we need to, you might say, attack the problem, is with the klesha. He also said that we need more than an intellectual understanding of this process in order for it to work. We need to feel it really deeply. We need to, in his words, feel it in our mind and our heart. You want to take it into your experience. I like that phrase. You want it to become part of you. Now, he brings up an interesting point at this juncture here. He talks about feeling that negative emotion is not a good term to translate klesha, because some afflictions are not emotions. Specifically, he mentions delusion, that it's not indifference and ignoring things. It's not attachment, and it's not aversion. That it's just plain not knowing the true nature of things. So his advice is, of course, is to don't respond to the actions of people that are acting under the kleshas, that give them space and give them forgiveness. And this is a topic that really isn't discussed all that much in Tibetan Buddhism. But basically what forgiveness is letting go of wanting to change the person, letting go of anger or resentment towards what that person did to you or what they did to somebody else. You could say it's letting go of the past so that there is room in the future for growth. If you keep being unable to forgive a person, basically you are holding on to resentment, which is a mental affliction. And you're causing yourself a lot of difficulties. You're accumulating negative karma, you're making yourself unhappy, maybe nervous, and so on and so forth. It just creates all kinds of problems. So forgiveness is really important, and it's really important to learn how to forgive if you haven't learned already. And if you have, it's important to, you might say, develop more thoroughly in that area. Forgiveness isn't just forgiving and then forgetting. It's realizing that what that person did is not even, it's not even necessary to forgive the action. You don't start there, but that's where you end up. And again, this is going right back to what this verse is all about, is that we take defeat and we give victory to others. When we are being attacked, he says, meditate on compassion, that the attacker needs help as they are out of control. And it is this place that we need to increase our compassion, work on developing our compassion, work on increasing our wish to benefit others, especially this difficult being that is under the control of the kleshas. He uses another example here, which is very interesting. He uses the example of being sued. And I will say this, that he has been sued before in India in court. So he is familiar with this process. He's no stranger. He's not just talking about something that he's read about or heard about from other people. So he says it's best not to let it take over your mind if you are being sued. That if you do that, it just increases your anger. And that what is important here is rationality and clear thinking. And when your anger increases, all of that goes out the window. He says, if you can let your mind rest naturally, you will think rationally and be able to make good decisions. And of course, that's what you want, is a good decision at a time like this, which is difficult. Without that, then the outcome, as it has been, you might say, the situation has been blurred by the kleshas where there is no clarity. The outcome then frequently is not very good. And if we look at ourselves and look at others, we will see that plenty of bad decisions have been made while being under the influence of strong kleshas, that we make bad choices in situations like that. He says, but this is one of the things that is really important and beneficial. And this is what makes this like, I think he used the word finding a jewel in a previous chapter, that by examining our own minds to find the kleshas, by looking deeply and clearly, that we, quote, need the experience of how dark the blackness of ignorance actually is. We need to feel the heat of anger. End quote. With this experience and knowledge, we are much better able to understand what another person is doing when they're trying to harm us. So this is how we can learn from our own previous experience and behavior. That we need to recognize our afflictions and not pretend that we don't have any, or we have been able to uproot them, or we are almost completely finished uprooting them. There's not much left to do. And if we look back, we'll find that there have been many times in the past, maybe even the recent past, when we've been overcome by afflictions in various situations, when we have lacked mindfulness and awareness. And so the point that he is making here is that we need to apply mindfulness and awareness to recognize these afflictions that others will help bring up for us. Then he kind of takes a brief pause from his teaching here to talk about the 84,000 afflictions of sentient beings, of humans, I believe, is where this figure comes from. And he says that this is probably just an indication of a very large number, not an actual list of 84,000 different kleshas. He's trying to be simple here. So he kind of lumps all of these 84,000 different types of kleshas or poisons into the three main poisons. And he starts out by saying that anger is the easiest to recognize. And desire is more difficult to recognize, and delusion is the hardest to recognize, because you don't even recognize that you're deluded. You think that what you are experiencing and seeing and the way you are seeing things is real, is the actual way things are, rather than being deluded experience. He says that what we need to do is make friends with our kleshas. We need to get to know them. That, quote, we need to have the experience of the afflictions through listening, contemplating, and meditating. So this is a way to deeply get to know these mental afflictions. And this is very, very important. It is Mingyur Rinpoche that frequently talks about making friends with them. The language is slightly different. The meaning is the same. Get to know these kleshas very, very, very well. That the more you know about them and the way you relate to them and respond and so forth, the better off you are, because they will have less influence on you. He says, make an effort every day to recognize the faults of the afflictions, that we need to examine them every day. and ask questions like, what is their nature? How do they function? He says to examine them from different viewpoints and perspectives. So really get to know them very, very, very thoroughly. If you don't make an effort to do this, it won't happen. And if it doesn't happen, not much will happen in terms of you and traveling the path. He then goes on, the Karmapa then goes on to mention that faults and afflictions are not separate. We don't have afflictions here and then faults there. We just need to get rid of the faults. That the afflictions and the faults are not separate. The nature of the affliction is the fault, and yet you cannot remove the fault without removing the affliction. Reading this brought to mind something that Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche has said a few years ago, and it is that the problem with sentient beings is they think their faults are qualities. So obviously the first thing is to recognize the faults, to find out what the faults are, recognize them, and then start working on removing them. And again, this requires, among other things, mindfulness and awareness. It requires accepting defeat and giving victory to others, and so forth. So we can't remove the faults without removing the affliction. It just doesn't work any other way. So he finishes up the chapter by talking about recognition of faults. And he says that recognition happens in an instant. It may take years and years of training before you recognize a particular fault. But at one moment, then you recognize it and realize that you have recognized it. And as was brought up at the beginning, problems in our lives help us with this recognition. It's very, very important to reflect on things when a klesha or an afflictive mind arises. Be aware of what conditions gave rise to this happening. To put it in very blunt terms, my buttons just got pushed. How did they get pushed? And examine. The more you know, the more you understand about this, the less reactive you are. Eventually, you might say, uninstall those buttons that keep getting pushed. So to sum up this chapter, he says that this method of taking defeat and giving victory to others is how we turn our faults into precious jewels. That's a quote, precious jewels. We can have this is interesting because he used the word hope, that with these teachings, we can have the hope that in the future, we will be grateful that we have had faults. Because these faults will be turned into precious jewels. We will have turned confusion into wisdom. and we've learned how to do it. So to finish up, he says, don't be discouraged by reflecting on how much negative karma you have accumulated since the beginning. This beginning, don't become discouraged by thinking about how far you have to progress. This is not important. The important thing is to have courage and work on it and progress.